This is an excerpt from The Secret of Secrets, Your Key to Subconscious Power by USAndersen. The reading is entitled, The Core of the Problem. God dwelleth always right where thou art. Shed thy ego, and thou wilt soon see hidden within thy most secret heart a plan that is perfect for thee. We punish ourselves. Alex was a middle-aged man in a Midwestern city. His history was an astonishing record of failure. Whatever he turned his hand to eventually crumbled about him. There came a time when he could not even find a job. He and his family were destitute. His wife said, "I can't understand it. Alex is the kindest man I've ever known. He's a hard worker, and I know he's smart. Other men, smaller, meaner men, are successful, but poor Alex, all his luck is bad." "Does he think so?" she was asked. She nodded. "He believes God is punishing him." It took a long time to persuade Alex that God punishes no one. His guilt complex was so deeply rooted that he was dangerously passive. He felt compelled to be kind to others because of this guilt, but he expected nothing but misfortune in return. His personality was so involuted that he lived as if in a funnel. He was all turned in on himself. Only when he began to sense finally the infinite spiritual presence of God did his ego start to dissolve. Then he began to see other people for the first time, not as extensions of his own personality, but as living embodiments of God. His sense of personal worth grew as he gained humility. One day he was offered a job by a chance acquaintance. Today he is vice president in that company. The president says of him, "Alex inspires confidence. Something looks out of his eyes and says, 'I like you. Let's be partners.'" God consciousness, indeed, has remade the life of this one-time failure. Seeds of Destiny. Each of us carries within him the spiritual causes that determine his destiny. Sometimes these causes are not so much spiritual as psychological prompters, and when they become twisted through hate, fear, bitterness, or resentment, our lives can be driven calamitously. But psychological prompters, no matter how deeply buried in the subconscious, can be overcome by spiritual understanding. This understanding may be arrived at by intellectual grasp, by suffering, or simply by humility, very often by all three, but once arrived at, it is as a new birth of the soul. That which you fancy yourself to be you never really has been, for it is a thing that changes with the seasons and alters with the tides. What you truly are is a permanent thing, changeless, with its foundations planted in eternity. To let go of the old self and cleave to the new is the essence of spiritual growth. This new birth, without which, Jesus said, a man cannot enter the kingdom of heaven, completely alters the world. He who views the world through the ego sees all things as existing outside himself. He feels separate, isolated, and the world appears to him as a series of unrelated things and objects, all possessing certain inherent dangers to his own being. He feels small, harassed, unloved. To him the world seems cruel and unjust. Yet when he awakens to his true spiritual self, all the old fears and hates and resentments dissolve. He then sees his kinship with all things, attains to spiritual identification with them, grows into a spiritual oneness with all creation that no longer leaves room for his personal ego and all its wounds and vanities. By letting go of his small self, he attains to a vast self, a self that encompasses all things. Then at last he recognizes with Walt Whitman, The whole theory of the universe is directed to one individual, namely to you. Spiritual rebirth. It is through spiritual rebirth that we overcome all things. It is through our growth into the spiritual image of God that the purpose of life is fulfilled. For that purpose did spirit first become involved in matter. To that end shall it one day be free. We are such materialists in this age of electronics and atom bombs that there is often much scoffing about the spiritual existence of man. Many there are who state that man is body only, that he comes into existence as a machine destined to run a certain length of time, that the apparent director within him is only an illusion fostered by the machine's acquisition of rational habit patterns. What a desert of mind and soul such a belief must be! What else can the holder of such a belief do but spin his futile existence in a web of frustration and resentment? Look into the eyes of your loved ones, and you will know at once the living presence of spirit. It need not be weighed, measured, and counted. It is there, and you recognize it. All the mathematics and logic in the world can neither prove nor disprove it, but you know it just the same. Spirit recognizes spirit, for it is the same in each of us, invisible and indivisible. This knowledge, though it exists in the intuitive center of every man, nevertheless needs some logical justification before it can break through the mental barriers of this materialistic age. It is all well and good, says the materialist, to talk of feelings and intuitions, but you must admit that they cannot be proved or disproved. What religion needs is something concrete, a fact, something provable. Well, feelings are provable. All of us recognize an act of bravery, an act of love, an act of kindness. Why then must there always be so much doubt over the validity of the conduct of a man who claims to know God? All actions spring from feelings, many of them from the most spiritual feelings, and if it were not for these intangibles, which no one can weigh, measure, or even classify adequately, this world would be as still and silent as a tomb. Master of creation. It is spirit, soul, consciousness that is ever first cause, master and mover of creation, alpha and omega of existence. It is God's stuff, infinite, eternal, changeless, arrested but a moment in form, manifesting its myriad appearances as a dancer might display infinite numbers of costumes, but remaining always one, indivisible and changeless. This is God, not a giant-sized man, not even a God as we might imagine in our minds and make an image of, but a power, a presence, a being, an infinite intelligence, pervading all and creating all, yet remaining unaltered amongst the ever-changing. A professor at a Western university was illustrating to his class examples of deductive and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning, he stated, is to reason from an effect to a cause. For example, I know I exist. I did not make myself or the world I live in. Therefore, I deduce that someone else did. This is someone I call God. Now, inductive reasoning, on the other hand, is to reason from cause to effect. For example, I know that I think, and that this thinking increases my knowledge. Inductive reasoning, therefore, tells me that I may increase knowledge of my Creator through taking thought. That, gentlemen, in a nutshell, is all that is going on in this world. Wise man, he knew God through mind, but truth to tell, he also knew him through his heart. Shedding the ego. Now, the core of the problem of existence is this. Most of us believe ourselves to be creatures of circumstance, pushed around by the whims of fate, and buffeted on all sides by forces over which we have no control. When we do manage to persuade ourselves that we can exercise control over our inner and outer lives, we often do so with a magnified ego that has convinced us of our power through fostering the illusion that we are better than others. Obviously, such a delusion is doomed to short life. We attain to mastery neither through magnified ego, the worst of all possible solutions, nor through an involuted ego that brings a sense of personal worthlessness. We take the first and most important step to mastery by shedding the ego altogether and identifying ourselves with God. While the foregoing may be read by many, it will be the rare reader who at once penetrates its meaning. For to let go of personal self is to suffer a kind of death. To shed the ego means to attain to a state of personal abstraction, wherein we can view ourselves with detachment, neither condoning nor condemning, aware of our personal existence, neither more nor less than we are aware of the existence of our fellows. It is this state of consciousness that teaches us to love our neighbors as ourselves, not necessarily through an increased love for our neighbors, but more through a less personalized and more detached regard for ourselves. In this state, we learn to identify ourselves with a greater consciousness, a vast intelligence. We feel it underlying our existence, buoying us up, supporting us, giving us our awareness. Little by little, we view our personal existence as through the inverted end of a telescope. Now we begin to see what we truly are and to let go of what we never really have been. Now the world is changed. It has no more resemblance to what it was before than we have to what we were before. For in the words of Evelyn Underhill, we behold at any specific moment not that which is, but that which we are. The infinite power. God, first cause, unlimited consciousness, infinite intelligence, involves himself in matter and manifests in myriad forms, not to prove anything, not to fight anything, not to overcome anything, not to separate right from wrong, but only for the pure joy of expression. And this, as we know it, is the beginning of things, of the manifest world, of the stars, of the planets, of life. God himself becomes involved in matter, and what he becomes, while indefinitely less than himself in form and substance, nevertheless is himself, true and entire, in spiritual potential. Nothing can become this or that but God. God is all. There is nothing else. And so consciousness is arrested in form, in being, spun out in space and time as a man or a woman, calling itself by a name, peering outward at a world that seems to dwarf it, overcome by problems because it assumes itself to be contained within that world rather than perceiving the truth, which is that the world is contained within it. This is man, who has isolated himself with his developing ego, cut himself off from the roots of his power, which are firmly placed in the reaches of space and time. Something deep inside. Joe McAdams was a strong, husky young man, a flyer in World War II. Joe had a vast appetite for life. He played and fought and laughed and frolicked, and in general comported himself like an enthusiastic bear cub. Then one day his plane was shot down. Joe was wounded in both legs, but managed to parachute from the flaming ship. He landed in the sea, where he floated for hours in his life jacket. Sharks attacked him.